Absolutely. Here's Keynote 1 expanded to approximately 500 words, written from the boy's perspective, capturing tension, unease, and the start of the unsettling relationship. Hashtag Keynote 1. The arrival. He was my dad's friend. I'd known him for years, or at least I thought I had. He had this easy smile, the kind of smile that made adults trust him without question. My dad laughed when he came around, always clapping him on the back, calling him a good guy. I smiled too, because that's what you do when grown-ups are happy. But even the first time he lingered near me, I felt it. Something in the way he looked at me didn't feel right. At first, it was subtle, a glance that lasted a little too long, a smile that felt like it wasn't meant for me, but somehow landed directly in my chest. I didn't understand it. I couldn't put it into words. And even if I had, would anyone have believed me? He was my dad's friend. Everyone trusted him. The first time alone in the room together, I tried to focus on something else, the TV, my hands, the floor, but it was impossible. He leaned just a little too close while we talked about the game, his arm brushing mine, and I felt that strange mix of curiosity and fear. My stomach twisted. I wanted to look away, but part of me couldn't. It was like being caught in a current I didn't understand. I started noticing patterns. The way he always found a reason to sit near me. The way his voice seemed lower when he spoke to me. The way he smiled at things no one else would notice. It made me uncomfortable, but it also made me pay attention. I became aware of him in ways I didn't want to be aware of. Every time he entered a room, I felt the air change. The most confusing part was how he acted around my dad. Normal, laughing, joking, helping with projects. No one would ever guess that the way he looked at me was different. That tension existed only when no one else was paying attention, only when we were alone. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. I didn't even know if it was knowledge yet, just a feeling that something was wrong, that something had shifted, though I couldn't explain how. I tried to brush it off, to act normal. I smiled when my dad made jokes, nodded at his questions, helped with chores like always. But inside, a storm was building. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew one thing clearly. I was paying attention now, in a way I hadn't before. And whatever this was, it wasn't going away. That first summer, when he started coming around more often, everything changed. It was subtle at first, a look, a lingering presence. But I noticed. And once you notice something like that, it never goes away. It wasn't just that he was my dad's friend anymore. He had become something else entirely, something I couldn't name, something I couldn't ignore. And I knew, deep down, that my life was about to get a lot more complicated. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 2 expanded to approximately 500 words, continuing from the tension of Keynote 1 and delving into growing unease and fear. Hashtag Keynote 2. The uneasy routine after the first summer of subtle glances and lingering presence. His visits became more frequent. At first, it seemed innocent, just another family friend coming over for dinner or to help with some project. But I started noticing the way he moved through the house, the way he lingered just a little too close, his eyes always finding mine even when I tried to hide. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was something heavier, something that made my stomach tighten whenever he was around. I began timing my movements, avoiding rooms when I knew he'd be there. A trip to the kitchen suddenly felt like a minefield, every step calculated so I wouldn't catch his gaze. My dad never noticed. He was too busy chatting, laughing, thinking everything was fine. And how could I tell him that the man he trusted so completely was making me feel unsafe? It felt impossible. At school, my mind wandered more than usual. I replayed moments over and over. The way he leaned on the counter when he helped with dinner, the brush of his hand when passing me a plate, the way he smiled at something I said, as if it held some secret meaning. No one else would have noticed. No one else would have understood. It was like carrying a private weight, a secret that didn't have a name yet. One afternoon, my dad asked me to help him with something in the garage while he and his friend talked outside. I wanted to disappear. I tried to focus on the toolbox in my hands, the screws, the nails, anything to distract myself. But then he appeared in the doorway, leaning casually, smiling. My heart pounded. I wanted to step back to escape, but my body froze. That look, calm, almost casual but intense, locked onto me again. I felt exposed, like he could see all the corners of me, I didn't even know existed. I started avoiding eye contact, but even then I could feel him noticing, measuring, calculating. I didn't know why, and I didn't want to know. The fear settled in quietly at first, like a shadow across the floor, but it grew quickly. I began questioning myself. Was I imagining it? Was I overreacting? But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I couldn't unsee the way he looked at me. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it crept into everything. Mealtime, homework, weekend trips, all of it came with a new tension I had never experienced before. I learned to anticipate his presence, to brace myself for the moments when I would inevitably catch that look. And each time, my chest tightened, my stomach knotted, and the quiet terror whispered, "You can't tell anyone." It was a strange, confusing mix of fear and fascination, disgust and curiosity. My mind was constantly on edge, analyzing every glance, every word, every action. I started feeling trapped in my own home, a place that should have been safe. The person I should have been able to trust the most, my dad, had no idea, and I wasn't sure I could ever bring myself to tell him. That's when the silence started to feel heavier than anything else. It was suffocating, almost physical, pressing down on me, telling me to stay small, to stay quiet. And the longer it continued, the more I realized, whatever this was, wasn't going to stop on its own. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 3 expanded to approximately 500 words, continuing the story as tension escalates and the narrator begins noticing the danger more clearly and wrestling with fear. #####Keynote 3. The weight of awareness. By the time the third summer rolled around, it was impossible to ignore what was happening. What had begun as subtle glances and uneasy feelings had grown into a constant, low hum of fear that followed me everywhere. Even when I tried to distract myself, running errands with my dad, helping in the garage, or reading in my room, I felt it. His presence lingered in my thoughts, in the way I anticipated the sound of his footsteps, in the way I measured every move I made when he was around. I began noticing things that terrified me. The way he would enter a room and find an excuse to be near me, the way his voice would drop just slightly when speaking to me, the almost imperceptible way he would brush against my arm by accident. Each incident alone could have been dismissed as coincidence, but together they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. My body was learning before my mind could fully process it. Danger existed here, and no one else was aware. Fear became my constant companion. I stopped volunteering to help with tasks he might be involved in. I invented excuses to stay in my room. I avoided certain times of day when I knew he would be present. My dad never noticed, or perhaps he did notice and didn't understand. The tension built silently between us, like a wall I couldn't climb. But awareness came with a strange clarity. I realized that staying silent only gave him power. The longer I pretended nothing was wrong, the more control he had over me. The fear that had started as a whisper now demanded attention. It forced me to see him not just as my dad's friend, but as a threat. And for the first time, I began imagining what it would mean to reclaim some control, however small. Even then, the thought of speaking up seemed impossible. How could I explain this to my dad without shattering the trust he had in someone he considered a friend? How could I tell anyone what it felt like to be looked at in a way that twisted both fear and curiosity inside me? The words felt trapped, lodged in my throat, impossible to release. So I watched. I learned. I memorized his patterns, the way he laughed at certain jokes, the way he shifted when I entered a room. I discovered tiny ways to avoid being alone with him, routes through the house, excuses to leave the room, distractions to keep my mind occupied. Every day felt like a balance between survival and observation. I was learning to protect myself in silence, to navigate this danger without anyone else knowing. And yet, despite the careful strategies, the weight of his gaze lingered. I could feel it even when he was out of sight, a shadow in the corners of my mind, reminding me that nothing had truly changed. This realization was terrifying. The truth was unavoidable. The longer this continued, the more it would define me, unless I found a way to act. That summer, I'd understood something I hadn't before. Fear alone was not enough. Awareness alone was not enough. Survival meant vigilance, strategy, and eventually, courage. The problem wasn't just him. It was the silence that allowed him to exist unchallenged. And I knew, deep down, that the moment to break that silence was coming. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 4 expanded to approximately 500 words, continuing the story as the tension escalates and the narrator begins testing boundaries and reclaiming small pieces of control. #####Keynote 4. Testing the limits. By now, the fear had become a constant companion, a weight in my chest I could never ignore. But something was shifting. The fear that had once paralyzed me was starting to transform into something sharper, a determination I barely understood. I began noticing not just the way he looked at me, but the way he assumed I would always comply, that I would always remain silent. And that assumption, more than anything, made my blood run cold. It started small. The first time I consciously tried to assert a boundary, it was just a subtle thing. Moving away when he leaned too close, refusing to answer a question immediately, redirecting the conversation. My heart pounded in my chest with every tiny act of defiance. But each success was like a spark, giving me a sliver of power back. For the first time, I realized that he wasn't invincible, that my silence had been the thing giving him strength. The next step was harder. During a weekend visit, my dad had stepped out to run errands, leaving the house quiet. He smiled at me, leaning against the counter as if nothing had ever happened. But this time I didn't flinch. I held his gaze, steady, letting him feel the subtle resistance I was building. It wasn't overt. It wasn't confrontational, but it was deliberate. And for the first time, I saw hesitation flicker across his face. The realization hit me hard. The power dynamic wasn't absolute. The fear he had instilled could be challenged. That one moment of subtle defiance was like a door opening in a dark room I'd spent years trapped inside. I didn't know what would come next or how far I could push, but I knew that I could no longer allow him to define the space around me. Still, it was complicated. Every act of resistance came with a mix of exhilaration and terror. I wanted to speak up to tell someone, but the thought of shattering my dad's trust, or worse, of being disbelieved, kept me silent. Instead, I relied on small victories, walking out of rooms where he lingered, answering questions briefly and neutrally, using excuses to avoid being alone. Each time, I felt a fraction of control return, like pieces of myself that had been held hostage were slowly being released. And yet, the shadow of him was always there. Even as I asserted my boundaries, I couldn't escape the tension, the unspoken threat that lingered in every glance, every movement. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, but necessary. I was learning, inch by inch, how to navigate a world that had suddenly become dangerous. By the end of that summer, something remarkable had changed. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't free yet, but I had learned how to protect myself in the smallest ways. I had begun reclaiming my space, my voice, my presence. And in doing so, I realized that the moment would come when silence would no longer be an option. The hardest part wasn't learning to assert boundaries. It was understanding that once I did, everything would change. Nothing could go back to the way it was before. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 5 expanded to approximately 500 words, where tension peaks and the narrator faces a pivotal moment of confrontation or realization. ###Keynote 5. The breaking point that summer, the tension that had been simmering for months reached a point where it became impossible to ignore. Every glance, every subtle movement, every lingering smile carried weight. I couldn't pretend it was normal anymore. The fear that had once been a shadow at the edges of my awareness had grown into a constant, pressing presence. I was exhausted from the vigilance, from measuring every step and word, from pretending nothing was wrong. Something had to change. It started with an ordinary afternoon. My dad was busy in the backyard, and he was supposed to be helping with a project, leaving the house unusually quiet. He appeared in the doorway, as if he had no idea I had been bracing for him. That look, calm, familiar, and terrifying all at once, locked onto me, and I felt the old surge of fear. My chest tightened, my palms sweated, but this time, something different stirred inside me: resistance. For the first time, I allowed myself to respond, not with words, but with presence. I refused to look away. I refused to shrink. Every fiber of me screamed to flee, but I stood my ground. It was subtle, a slight hesitation in my posture, a deliberate choice to not retreat, but it was enough to make him pause. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That pause, brief as it was, felt like a turning point. The power dynamic had shifted, if only slightly. The fear that had consumed me for so long now collided with the realization that I could resist, that I could reclaim some fraction of control. The moment was electric and terrifying because I knew that asserting myself, even subtly, would change everything. There was no going back to the old routine, but the relief was fleeting. Every instinct screamed that danger was still there, that his presence remained a threat. I could feel it in the way he lingered, in the subtle intensity of his gaze. It was a reminder that this was far from over. Fear still existed, but now it was tempered by awareness and a flicker of courage. I had taken the first real step toward reclaiming myself. Even in that small victory, I realized the enormity of what lay ahead. Speaking up, setting boundaries, seeking help, these weren't just choices. They were challenges that could change relationships, fracture trust, and open wounds. But I understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. The fear had become a catalyst, not just a prison. By the end of that afternoon, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and empowerment. The tension hadn't vanished. It had transformed. I had faced it head-on, and for the first time, I knew I could survive it. I understood that reclaiming my space wasn't just about avoiding harm. It was about taking back pieces of myself that had been held hostage. The breaking point wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a shouted argument. It was a quiet, internal revolution, a moment where fear and courage collided, and I realized that change had begun. The road ahead would be long, and the shadows would not disappear overnight. But I had taken the first step, and that first step mattered more than anything else. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 6 expanded to approximately 500 words, focusing on the aftermath, reflection, and growing understanding of the impact of the experience. ####Keynote 6. The aftermath after that pivotal moment. Life didn't immediately change. The tension didn't vanish overnight, nor did the lingering fear disappear. But something subtle had shifted inside me. I carried a new awareness, a sharpened sense of vigilance, and an understanding that my voice, though small, tentative, and cautious, had power. I realized that surviving wasn't about ignoring the problem. It was about understanding it, acknowledging it, and finding ways to navigate it without losing myself entirely. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because I had taken that small but significant step of resistance. Anxiety because I knew the situation was far from resolved. He continued to come around, smiling, talking, acting as if nothing had ever happened. Yet beneath that familiar exterior, I saw the subtle recognition of my boundaries. He hesitated now, just slightly, as if testing how far he could push, but my quiet defiance made it clear that things were different. I started reflecting on how much this experience had changed me. Suddenly, I noticed how carefully I had walked through life, measuring each interaction, anticipating danger, and second-guessing myself constantly. The experience had sharpened my awareness, teaching me to read people and situations in ways I never had before. But it had also left me with lingering shadows, a sense of vulnerability and a fear of trusting too easily. I had learned hard lessons about boundaries, manipulation, and the ways fear can quietly shape one's world. I also began to understand the complex emotions that had been swirling inside me for so long. There had been fear, yes, but also confusion, curiosity, and even a strange, conflicting sense of attention I didn't fully understand. Coming to terms with these feelings was difficult. I realized that acknowledging them didn't make me weak or complicit. It made me human. It was part of the process of reclaiming myself, of understanding the experience fully so I could begin to heal. At the same time, I began noticing my own strength. Each moment of resistance, each subtle boundary I asserted, had been an act of courage. I had survived a situation that could have been paralyzing, and in doing so, I had discovered parts of myself I hadn't known existed. My ability to observe, to anticipate, and to act, even in the smallest ways, was a testament to resilience. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a turning point. As the summer faded, I realized that life could not return to the way it had been before. The experience had left its mark, and ignoring it was no longer possible. But in that mark lay power, the power to recognize danger, the power to protect myself, and the power to reclaim my voice piece by piece. I began to understand that fear alone didn't define me. My response to it did. And with that realization came a quiet resolve. The next steps, whatever they were, would be taken deliberately, carefully, but without hesitation. Survival had been the first stage. Reclaiming my life had just begun. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 7 expanded to approximately 500 words, where the story moves toward confrontation, reflection, and emotional resolution. #, Keynote 7. Facing the shadow. By the time the next season rolled around, the weight of what had happened and the tension it carried were impossible to ignore. The fear that had once been a constant companion had transformed into a quiet alertness, a lens through which every interaction was filtered. I had learned to observe, to anticipate, and to assert boundaries in small but meaningful ways. And yet, deep down, I knew that vigilance alone wasn't enough. Something had to give. It wasn't about confrontation in the traditional sense, not yelling, not creating a scene, but about facing the reality of the situation and understanding it fully. I realized that this experience had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. The heightened awareness, the lingering anxiety, and the subtle, self-protective strategies that had become second nature. But it had also revealed resilience, courage, and a growing ability to reclaim space that had once felt unsafe. One afternoon, alone in the house while my dad was away, he appeared again. His presence was calm, familiar, but it carried the same unsettling undertone I had come to recognize. My body tensed, but my mind was clearer than ever. This time, I didn't shrink. I met his gaze steadily, not with defiance that sought to provoke, but with a quiet assertion that I was no longer passive. I was aware. I was prepared. I was not afraid to claim my own boundaries. The shift was subtle but profound. For the first time, I could see hesitation in his eyes. The realization hit me hard. The power had always been influenced by silence and compliance. By reclaiming my attention and space, I was beginning to change the dynamic. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking, and frightening, but it was also empowering. I felt the weight lift slightly, as if acknowledging the truth aloud, even without words, had begun to release its grip. Reflection became essential. I spent long hours thinking about what had happened, trying to understand my feelings, and making sense of the confusion, fear, and conflicting emotions I had carried. I realized that while the experience had been terrifying, it had also taught me invaluable lessons about awareness, self-protection, and the importance of listening to intuition. I had discovered that boundaries were not just rules. They were tools for survival and self-preservation. Most importantly, I understood that moving forward required both vigilance and courage. The shadow of fear would not disappear completely, but I could control how it influenced me. I could use the lessons I had learned to navigate the world more wisely, to protect myself and others, and to reclaim parts of life that had been overshadowed by anxiety. By the end of that period, I felt a quiet strength I hadn't known before. The fear remained, but it was tempered by clarity, awareness, and the knowledge that I had survived and adapted. Facing the shadow didn't erase the past, but it gave me tools to shape my future. I understood that reclaiming my life wasn't a single event. It was a continuous process of observing, asserting, and learning. And for the first time, I knew I could handle whatever came next.